actually spent quite a lot of time revisiting, and I think I've probably been to about 80 belfries in the period between 2018 and the beginning of the first lockdown, to check and obtain extra information, and one or two cases to see things I hadn't seen. So I'm going to tell you about that tonight, and hopefully give you a picture of what it's like grovelling around Bedfordshire belfries. Right, now, why doesn't it want to go down a page? Ah, there we go. So, how it all started. Well, I learnt to ring back in 1966 when I was at boarding school in Worcester. And every afternoon we had to go for a run after school if we hadn't got something else to do. And I was desperately fed up with all this running. And someone said to me, "Why don't you come change ringing?" I had no idea where I was going. I didn't know I was going anywhere near bells. I didn't even know I was going to a church. Anyway, I found myself at All Saints Worcester, where I learnt to ring. And I was hooked from the start. And we had a very active school society. Here we are ringing a quarter peal at the cathedral, Bob Doubles on the Middle Six in 1968. And we also had a belfry works group. And we started tinkering around doing belfry repairs. This is a picture up St Swithun's, and that kid in the foreground wielding a hammer is me. So I had an early start in this this sort of thing, and got interested in belfries from that stage. I was taught to ring by a chap called Paul Cattermole. I don't know whether any of you knew him, but he was a very good ringer. Once master of the University of London Society, came from Norfolk, but his parents moved to Worcestershire, and one of his first jobs was at King's School, Worcester. And he had a school ringing society, but he's also very active in the area. But the thing about Paul was he was also interested in bell history, and so he taught me to ring. He also taught me about bells and bell frames. He tried to teach me maths with rather less success. And another interesting thing he did do when he was teaching maths was if you got into trouble, he'd get you writing lines, and those lines always had to be in Gothic script, which was really good at preparation for reading bell inscriptions. Anyway, I was delighted to maintain contact with Paul over the years, and in 2002, when he was really not very well, he did ask us up to ring a peal with him during the year when I was Master of the College U's. He particularly wanted to do that, and so a nice touch really. But Paul went on to write a couple of quite important books about bells, bell history, in Norfolk, bell profile, and also a series of books on Norfolk bells, of which the most notable was the one on Norwich itself. So when I was a lad, starting from I was about 15, Paul used to take us out on these forays into Worcestershire to towns like these. Wonderful names: White Ladies Aston, Dormston, 3 bell towns, and yes, we did used to ring them. And historically interesting, White Ladies Aston particularly has a wonderful 15th century bell frame, and Dormston has a frame that you can actually see how a 15th century frame was reconstructed in the 17th century. And those fittings on the top one towards the right, yes, great fun to ring, got nice and bumpy. So it was all part of my upbringing and background in ringing, from exploring these sort of places from very early on. Now, when I was at home in the school holidays in Warwickshire, I started exploring bells with a view to collecting information on the bells in the area. These are some of the first 2 churches I went to, both slightly difficult to get up to. So I started finding out how difficult it was to get around. But I made friends with the rector's son the day I called at Great Horn, and he and I went round quite a lot of churches together when we were both about 15. So what do you need to do if you're going to explore belfries? Well, you need a bit of a toolkit. First of all, old clothes, overalls, definitely. Stout shoes, you can very easily tread on nails and things that are painful. Face masks are a good idea for reasons I shall show you in a moment. A torch is absolutely essential. So many of the lesser known belfries just haven't heard of electric lighting yet. A camera, well, of course, digital photography today is so much easier than the days when you had 8 shots on a film and you had to use them carefully. Notepad, paper and pens, of course. Tape measure for measuring diameters, calipers for measuring thicknesses, tuning forks for taking notes, recording kit now for analysing the frequencies, and materials for making rubbings and plaster casts. I haven't actually made many plaster casts since my school days, but there in the middle is a colour one that I painted up And they make quite interesting and attractive displays. Rubbings are much more satisfactory, a very good and accurate record of what you're finding on bells. That date there shows how nice flat lettering can rub very, very well. I use a shaped pencil, and I always take a penknife with me up the tower so I can resurface the pencil as I go along, and then rub the pencil on very closely with a thumb, which means you rub the graphite, soft pencil 2B, rub that into the paper so that it makes a nice impression. Something very interesting in the middle there, astrological symbols on a bell at Clent near here. You never quite know what you're going to find. The county book on Worcestershire bells doesn't mention those at all, although it mentions all the other decorations you can see, the coin, the founder's mark with the initials IS and 3 bells, and the decoration. The significance I haven't managed to work out yet. Now, getting up towers can be tricky, and so it's always wise to take all this kit up in one go, rather than be coming up and down because you've forgotten something. And it's also good to take water, soap and towel. I've carried those in the car since way back, because coming down from a tower, you usually want to clean up afterwards. Taking notes, well, it's very important to record what you see, of course. And as I found with some of my Bedfordshire stuff, where I didn't take very thorough notes in a lot of my earlier visits, you know, you realise when you start writing things up that there's information you've missed. Ranald Clouston on the left used to use these forms, which he filled in absolutely meticulously. Ranald was the arch recorder of bell details. Chris Dalton did rather more stream of consciousness stuff. He wrote things down as he saw them and made sense of it afterwards. And Fred Sharp, one of the great 20th century writers on bells, made these remarkably neat, but actually rather thin on detail notes. But why do all this? I mean, partly to just enjoy belfries and see interesting things. As I hope you'll realise by the time I finish this talk, there are some fascinating things to see in belfries, and making a note of them all is good. It's also fun to be out with other people, picking up errors and filling gaps in what's been previously recorded, and the possibility of discoveries, whether it's bells that might be ringable, that it wasn't known they were ringable. Probably easier back in my earlier days of doing this than it is now, when so much more is known about places, or actually discovering bells that nobody knew about. But one way or another, all this information that I've been collecting over the past 50 years has gradually fed into what we've now got as a national bell inventory. It's going to soon all be on Dove, which is a real foundation of knowledge. So everything that I've done over the years is gradually contributing to that end. Well, belfry exploration. The first thing is getting up there. We as ringers are used to, on the whole, pretty easy access to ringing rooms. Getting up to bells can be a darn sight more difficult, even in places where you've got ringable bells. I think one of the worst places that I know is Little Malvern Priory in Worcestershire. It was a monastery, as the name obviously tells you. It's got a big tower, and at the top of it, in fact, there's a medieval 5-bell frame and just a single bell. It's a wonderful installation, but there's no access at all until the 1960s, which is one of the reasons it stayed intact. And then, without the health and safety standards of today, they installed this lovely 30-foot vertical ladder. Climbing the ladder is one thing. Opening the trapdoor and manipulating your way up into the next stage is quite another. It's pretty frightening when you get up to the top of that and you're looking down and you're trying to get your stuff and get into the chamber above. And then, believe it or not, there's another 20 feet above that and no floor to the bells when you get there. So that's a pretty extreme case, and I can't think of anything in Bedfordshire that matches up to that. Turrets, of course, are a particular difficulty. If you want to survey all the bells in a county, and I've done Warwickshire, Worcestershire and Bedfordshire and Greater Birmingham complete, as well as a lot of visiting elsewhere, documenting the turret bells is quite important. And, you know, back in the 1940s, no health and safety, just send a schoolboy up a ladder if you're a teacher. So there's a lad up there having a look at a bell. But you quite often have to bring in ladders specially, sometimes use access platforms. Chris Dalton, in the colour photo on the bottom row, was an absolute master of getting people into belfries on his own. His ladders strapped to the car, top of his car with a washing line, and the washing line was quite often used to hold 2 ladders together. But he got it up and down safely for many, many years. It's a bit easier if you just wait for repairs when the scaffolding up. Certainly done that in quite a lot of places. And nowadays, I've been National Trust Bells advisor for some years, and they quite often provide a cherry picker to get me up into belfries. So there's various things you can do, but getting proper details of turret bells is tricky. There are various perils in belfry exploration. First of all, if there's no floor to the bells, then there's a big drop underneath and not a lot to stand on. Of course, it's a rule to always stand on something that's reasonably solid and to test it well before you put your weight on it. But when you're about 20 feet above the next floor below, trying to get details of bells like the top left, it's tricky. Of course, belfry floors have to be treated with great caution. If you've got a dodgy floor, you've got the same drop underneath. Old ladders, there's a particularly scary one that just popped out of the hole in the wall about 20 feet above the ground. And it's a pretty slender sort of light metal ladder, probably put up in about the 1860s. No light in the belfry, I mentioned that before. Generally, belfries are pretty filthy places with debris, filth, cobwebs, and you name it. And when it comes to bird droppings, there can be real danger. This single bell in Worcestershire, I had to fight my way in through a solid layer of droppings to get in, wearing a mask, of course. And when I got up there, the pigeon was still there, as you can see. It's in the photo. Now, Paul Catamol, sadly, died as a result of pigeon guano that he'd inhaled too much in a belfry. So I'm very well aware of the perils. But all this can be great fun. I mean, just getting into some of these places can be fun, going around enjoying these things with other people. So here are some of my accomplices over the years, including some of us, Richard Jones and myself sitting in a turret at Allscott Park. And there's Christopher Dalton trying to get some ladders up in the church in Herefordshire, and he was defeated that day. Went back subsequently on his own and did manage to get up, but that's another story. Well, what about Bedfordshire? My first visit to Bedfordshire was on the way home after a Hertfordshire Open Day, 27th of April 1974. And on the way home, Christopher Dalton suggested we go to have a ring at Ravensden. An unringable 3, of course, even then, but Dalton managed to chat his way in and we had a ring. I did have a few years of being a bit of a naughty tower grabber, I have to confess. So we rang at Ravensden that night, and it was my first Bedfordshire tower. Funnily enough, we came back just a couple of weeks later for the AGM Open Day of the association and rang at the towers advertised here. Some lovely towers. Keesoe, always a favourite of mine, Bromham. We skipped Sharnbrook and Felmersham at lunchtime because we went to the pub. And we waited around after the meeting to ring at St Paul's, Bedford, but the ringing never happened. I believe it was the year that the AGM went on a long time because there was some real hassle about the accounts. And there were quite a few of us standing outside St Paul's hoping for a ring, but we didn't ring. During the time of the meeting, we went off and grabbed the 3 at Newton Blossomville, and then went into Olney where they were ringing a peal. So we had the bonus of doing that. My first peals in Bedfordshire, the first one was later in 1974 as well. A very slow peal of Bristol Royal on the 10 at Leighton Buzzard. There were 6 future colleges masters in the band, and I can remember that Andrew Wilby got the tower at fairly short notice, having failed to get one nearer to Leicester, and we dashed up to Leicester for a ringer's dinner in the evening. And then when I lived in Bedfordshire, my first peal was at Husband Crawley. Stephen, Jim Yates, Bob Churchill, Jeremy and Bob Piran, Ian Harris, Martin Major. What a super band. Great friends, and nice to start my peal ringing in Bedfordshire with them. You'll notice I rang the treble. Rather frightened of Stephen, I wasn't going to risk ringing London Major inside. And I actually arrived at the beginning of January 1978. Spent the first couple of weeks living Chez Regan at Flying Horse Cottage in Lidlington. And that evening, we went and explored the ruined church at Clophill, a tower that I never did get up to look at bells because there's no bells there. And in the evening, we went to the practice at St Paul's in some trepidation because it was my first meeting with Stephen. But actually, ringing at Bedford was one of the reasons I was attracted to apply for a job here, because I really wanted to be closer to London, and Bedford seemed by far the best place to come to be in London ringing and to have super ringing locally. And I must say, I was made very welcome at St Paul's from early on, and thoroughly enjoyed my time ringing in Bedford. And there's my workplace, the County Record Office, alongside what was then County Hall, now rather cynically renamed Borough Hall, and the view from the office window, which wasn't bad, was it? That was the view from our public search room anyway. Now, I came to Bedfordshire determined not to do a survey of Bedfordshire bells. By then, I was already trying to do Worcestershire. I was working very much on Warwickshire, which is my priority. And I made myself a clear resolution from the start. I wasn't going to do a survey of Bedfordshire bells. But if you look at the dates of these notes, 1978, Milton Bryan, 1979, Henlow, I was starting to collect information right from the early stages, and taking rubbings of bells too. So I wasn't doing it deliberately, but I started collecting. Work and ringing and belfry research did go quite well together. I wouldn't want you to think that as a public employee of the County Council, I spent all my time on bell stuff, not a bit of it. But I was responsible for much of my time in Bedford for church records, and that involved going around surveying records in churches and cataloguing them when we got them back to the record office for safekeeping. Many of the records were kept in the old sort of parish chests of the sort you can see there, the iron ones, that if anything got in too close contact with them, the documents would go rusty. The wooden ones quite stable environmentally, but not great for storage. So my main job was helping with run the public reading room and doing the ecclesiastical records survey. That was in my early days. As Linda said, I was technical advisor for the association for a couple of years, and also librarian. And one of the things that I did as librarian was a big exhibition for the centenary in 1982. That was a day and a half. Been working pretty hard on the exhibition for some months. Bob Piran did a lot of the photographs, and we rang an early morning peal at Bedford. If you look at the peal board, you'll see it started at 6:05 a.m. It was the week of the music festival, and the likelihood was that we weren't going to be allowed to ring because the music festival started at 9:30 in the morning. Anyway, at the AGM of St Paul's Ringers, we mentioned it to the vicar, and he said, well, I don't see any reason why you can't start at 6 o'clock if you need to. So that's what we did. We then went on and lost a peal at Woburn after 2 hours before 12 o'clock. So it was a bit of a heavy morning. Then out to Biggleswade to put up the exhibition, the dinner, take the exhibition down, and really slumped when I got home. It was one of the longest days of my life, I think. Anyway, I want to give the idea that work and ringing and belfry research did go side by side. I got in a bit deeper when I met a lovely chap called Ken Shrimpton at Felmersham in the early 1980s. Ken sadly died earlier this year, well into his 70s, but a lovely bloke, and he was interested in clocks, and he and I sort of teamed up and started going around looking at clocks together, and obviously the bells that go with them. He and I were going to produce a book on turret clocks in North Bedfordshire, and the actual project was unfinished, but Ken did go on to produce an e-book, and that's the cover of it on the left. I got more interested in clocks myself, and in my own time, I did a book on Bedfordshire clock and watchmakers for the Record Society. And ever since then, I've been a bit of an authority, if I can use the word, on clocks too. Also connected with work and really putting into print a lot of the stuff I'd picked up through cataloguing all the parish records, I did produce a series of 4 books while I was in Bedfordshire on Bedfordshire churches. Published by the Historical Record Society, and all with these garish covers, which you can't do anything about. But the books themselves contain historical summaries for each church, and then the archival sources that are of particular relevance to the 19th century. The glebe terriers, which are lists of church property and church goods, very often including bells as well as the church plate and so on. The Archdeacon's visitations, some reports on churches by a tractarian writer called W.A. John Martin, librarian at the Duke of Bedford, and some descriptions. So those are all there. Archive illustrations like the one of Kempston you can see here. And in the time after these books first came out, they're very much valued by the bishops and archdeacon, who used to like to dip into them for juicy things they could say when they're visiting parishes about their churches. I suspect they've been rather forgotten now. Anyway, fast forward to 1998 when I left. We'd had a successful time at the record office, and our team had twice won the government's prestigious Charter Mark Award for excellence in public services. And that was during my 12 years in charge as county archivist. As ringing, we'd had, as Lynn has already said, a very good band in the early years. After Steve Nivin left, the ringing did continue very strong at Bedford for best part of 10 years. And we had some successes in the 12-bell competition, including this one in Ipswich in 1991, when we came third. I would say to this day that my time in Bedford were the best years of my ringing life. And so I have very, very fond memories of time there. But as far as bells were concerned, by the time I left, despite my intention of not doing Bedfordshire, I had seen most of the bells in the county. Hadn't made detailed notes on all of them, but I'd seen most of them. And other people like Roger Kendrick and Ken Shrimp had kindly contributed stuff that was starting to build up towards a project, but I certainly had left with no intention of finishing it, because I'd already got an unfinished stained glass survey for the county, and I was still deep at work on my churches books when I left. So at that stage, writing up the bells wasn't on the to-do list. Anyway, the future has had a different story to tell. Time to stop rattling on about me and looking at some bells. Well, bells are of all ages and sizes. The ones in Bedfordshire range from the latest ones, of the current century, but go back to about 1150. The oldest in the county is the Sanctus at Leighton Buzzard, lives in the ringing room, and it dates from 1150. Very typical 12th century bell. If you turn it over, it's got a very flat lip, and generally the features are, it looks like a flower pot shape, got very tall cannons, but an absolute gem of a survivor. St Paul's tenor is the third heaviest bell in the county now, but of course is 2800 weight rather than 100 weight and a bit. So you've all this range of sizes and dates. For those of you who aren't familiar with bells and what they look like and what they tell us, they're actually semi-autobiographical. They tell us a lot about themselves. The inscriptions, the decorations on them are always informative. Earlier medieval bells are very seldom dated, but they have lettering that's distinctive, and particular types of lettering belongs to particular founders and periods. The old bells at Campton, now the chiming bells, have two of this date by William Culverden of London, about 1520. And in the middle of that rubbing on the left is his mark, which actually has a rebus in it. If you put all the symbols together with the letters that are on it, it makes up the word Culverden. I won't explain it, but that's how we know they're definitely by Culverden. Come the late 16th century, and you start to get dated bells, and from about 1580s onwards, most bells carry a date. They also carry distinctive makers' marks and lettering, and sometimes inscriptions saying very barely, "Be it known to all that do me see that Newcomb of Leicester made me." Not a lot of doubt about that then, is there? And one of the ones at Blenheim, which looks very similar to the two on the top there, actually has an additional mark saying Robert Newcomb made me. So there are makers' badges and marks that tell us who cast these bells. Inscriptions provide information and tell us things as well. The tenor at Arlesey, for example, has only an 1877 bell, but has quite a long inscription on its waist, telling us that the bell was given by the vicar in memory of his grandfather. And names the churchwardens and rector and churchwardens of the time. With the old bells at Leighton Buzzard, an inscription saying John Swinstead did through perseverance raise this peal complete. Real merit is his praise. Swinstead, in other words, was the man who raised the money and persuaded the parish to have 8 bells instead of the heavy 6 they'd had previously. And his name crops up in a number of other parishes as well. So a bit of a story there, just coming out of an inscription. If you go around belfries, you expect to see bells old and new, and old and new. There's the top in quotes. On the left is a genuine medieval bell at Chalgrave, the treble there, cast in about 1440 at Wokingham, and a beautiful bell with a dragon mark on it, a very fine cross, and some nice Gothic lettering. See, those lines I had to do for Paul Cattermole paid off. I can read that as saying Sancte. On the right-hand side, a modern bell at Bromham, recast 1907 as it said on its waist, But look at the top, it's got a facsimile inscription on it, reproduced exactly as it was on the previous bell, saying that it was cast by Chandler in 1686. So you find a mixture of information coming off bells, and just because bells are new doesn't mean always that there's no history to them. Of course, one of the things that I was looking out for is bells by local founders. They're by and large charted in North's book, but it's interesting to go around and see which ones are still there. There were medieval bells cast in the county because there was a bell foundry at Toddington. Old Warden Forth was one of them, cast by John Rufford about 1370, and we'll see another one later. There's another one of those at Stotfold, and there was one at Kempston, recast in the 1890s. The best known of the local founders were the Russells and Emertons of Wootton. Thomas Russell, who was originally a clockmaker born in Hampshire, trained in London, worked as a clockmaker in Bedfordshire for about 10 years before he started casting bells. And from 1710 to 1743, he and his two sons ran a foundry at Wootton. William Emerton took up the foundry. He too was a clockmaker after a gap of just over 20 years, and cast bells until 1689, when he died while riding on his horse to Ampthill Market. That brought the Wootton foundry to an end. So lots of Wootton bells still in the county. And I'm not showing you anything here, but don't forget St Neots is only just over the boundary. Joseph Eyre was there, Edward Arnold was there, and the early tailors later at Loughborough were at St Neots. There's plenty of interest to see in terms of frames and fittings. Battleston, for example, has a marvellous 16th century frame. Notice the carved ends to the heads of the frame, and generally the detail on the right-hand side is added. But the original parallel trusses are all early, and they've been dendrodated by tree ring dating to about 1549. The bells are now just a chime, and one of them is cracked. Little Barford has a marvellous assembly of fittings. You can see here there's wedged ironwork holding the bells to the headstocks. And the pattern of wheel is very much of the distinctive St Neots type. It's not the same configuration of spokes as a modern bell hanger's wheel. And also, a lot of the bells were hung by some of the firms that have long since gone out of business. At Edworth, there's a set of 3 hung by George Day of Eye, very prominent Suffolk bell hanger, whose work's found all over the eastern counties and in Herefordshire and Monmouthshire too. But we have some examples of his work in Bedfordshire, notably this job at Edworth. Another East Anglian founder, a marvellous engineer, and a lot of bells work around the turn of the century, is still perfectly in good serviceable order. This is Elstow Belfry before Steve repainted it, and shows the bells on their steel frame girder headstocks, but they ring very nicely. And Alfred Bell did a lot of work in Bedfordshire from about 1902 onwards. And in fact, tailors had been doing a lot of work, but Bell pushed them out because he was a lot cheaper. A slightly unusual and rather distinctive early Millers and Steinbach frame at Pavenham, and Gillett and Johnson job at Tempsford in 1924, an H frame, and one of their early coreless headstocks. Initially, they used hollow section headstocks like tailors did, but tailors gave them a fair amount of stick because they were copying their pattern. And Gillett's went on to using these web style headstocks instead from about 1924 onwards. So you pick up little things that are of distinction and interest. So what makes an interesting belfry? Well, I think I'm going to take you to one tower in Bedfordshire and say, this is interesting, believe me. Wymington would be the place. It has this marvellous 14th century tower, just full of detail and carving. The arrow slots in the battlements, the details on the spire, the octagonal lantern stage, and so on. It's just a beauty. It's actually a very tall, very tiny tower. Inside, there's a derelict ring of 5. In fact, an additional bell was added in the late 19th century, and it was always said that it was never hung. I've quite recently found out that in fact it was hung, and there's some recorded performances of change ringing on the 6th. But by the late 19th century, when a ringer from Birmingham called John Wilson tried to teach a band, the bells were already in a pretty terrible state, and they more or less abandoned ringing there in the 1890s, and they're still in that abandoned state. But if you look at the plan here, you can see that the frame is, the 6-bell frame was on 3 tiers. The frame now is on 2 tiers with one above the other 4. And the 4 in the lower tier are all hung in such a way they swing into great gougings out in the wall. Every single bell swings into a hollow in the wall at the end of the pit. So it's a fascinating installation. The bells themselves are particularly interesting because 3 of them are still medieval, all cast in about 1440 by William Chamberlain of London. There's a record of the inscriptions of the bells in the 18th century, and at that stage, 4 of the medieval bells survived, and it's known, in fact, that there was a set of 5 here, all of the 15th century. Quite a remarkable place. Taylor's recast the tenor in 1814, but it had previously been recast by Norris of Stamford in 1676, and that's when the frame was put in. The frame has carved inscriptions on it, and it's got a date on it as well, 1676. Taylor's recast the treble in 1843, one of their early bells at Loughborough. The ground floor ringing room is an absolute treasure. It's neglected, but it's really got that feel of an untouched 19th century belfry. The bells now are barely safe for chiming, and you can see they're rung by these blue ropes when they're used at all. The clock hangs over the ringing room, and the bell rope maker's card is still on the door. There are change ringing figures penciled on the wall, and there are hollows in the wall for the ringers in the ground floor as well as up in the top for the bells. Let me just play you a clip of what they sound like. Shame they haven't been heard ringing for over 120 years. So upstairs, it's all pretty derelict, but really fascinating. The fittings are all old and mixed. The tenor headstock, second from the left on the bottom, is a Taylor headstock of 1814. That ironwork is very typical. You've got the plain bearings with wooden covers, like on the left hand. The date on the frame, number 3 from the left. And the tenor has a particularly interesting crown staple. Taylor's experimenting here in 1814 with, instead of a staple and a clapper top of the old sort, it's got a very modern type of clapper with a centre bolt fixed between the two lugs of the cast-in staple. So interesting things to see, but derelict as far as ringing is concerned. The story here is that the tower was restored in the 1930s. A concrete ring beam was put in. They were going to do a bell restoration. Taylor's quoted and came up with a plan for putting the bells on 2 tiers. But it was prevented by SPAB, who very strongly objected to a metal frame. Also, the president of the Central Council, believe it or not, blocked the restoration because he wouldn't allow the bells to be hung in such heavy bells to be rehung in the small tower. It seems absolutely bizarre to me that a restoration should have been opposed by the Central Council, but I can tell you that is fact. What about Marston? Well, one of Bedfordshire's great towers, like Elstow, a detached tower in the churchyard, and an amazing place because it's got a set of 5 bells, all cast by Hugh Watts I in 1610. The frame is almost certainly contemporary, and the fittings are rather later. Bells were rehung in 1890, but the tenor was cracked in 1893, and that's why ringing stopped. A 4-bell Elicum apparatus was installed in the 30s. You can see that before 1982, the place was absolutely filthy with pigeon debris. And it's still got the modern photograph below. It's pretty filthy now, but nothing like as bad as it was back then. So in 1982, we attempted to get some interest in a restoration project. There was a chap keeping the post office, Graham Odell, who was actually very keen on the bells and wanted to see something done. And we got them going to ring for a big church anniversary event in June 1982. First, we had to get rid of 300 bags of pigeon muck. And good old Jim Yates rigged up a dustbin and pulley arrangement so that we could get all the bags out of the tower very quickly. Haul the dustbin up, put the bag of droppings in, drop it down, unload it, and there we went. Great fun, but the dustbin ended up being buckled by the time we finished, so we had to buy the person who'd lent it a new dustbin. We had to do various repairs, including putting a couple of old second-hand wheels on. And I remember feeling, rather sad when I had to untie the rope between the higher frame and the wheel on the right-hand side of the drawing, because that's the frontispiece to Tom Ingram's book, Bells in England, 1954. And I felt I was destroying a little piece of history just when I untied that rope. The bells were originally rung from the ground floor through holes in the vaulting there. And there's the band that first rang them. A few well-known faces there: Brian Harris, Jim Yates, myself, Mark, Jeff Dodd in the back, Neil Skelton, Chris Dalton. And the bells were rung again a fortnight later when we had quite a lot of association members through one Saturday afternoon, and then on the Sunday we rang for the service. Sadly, the restoration scheme didn't go ahead. This is what they sound like. Happy days. And the sound at the end of that row of 5 was not the dustbin, it was the tenor. The other tower of the similar sort is Hatton Conquest. Absolutely fascinating belfry again. The frame is dated 1614 and it's very similar to the one at Marston. And the history here is that there were 5 bells in 1614, but they're increased to 6 later on and recast to a big 6 with a 1900 weight tenor in 1724, but lightened to a much lighter ring, the present 1200 weight 6 in 1841. And the treble, if you can see the bottom right-hand photo, has a huge wide headstock, far bigger than the bell. That's because it hangs in the old tenor pit. We tried to get special permission to ring these for the centenary, the anniversary of the tower, which was built in 1392, and the contract survives. We got permission from the architect. The vicar was very keen, and we're going to ring for the anniversary, for the special service again. But we were blocked on the day by Roy Ward, who was adamant that we were not going to ring. And when some of the people who'd come to ring disappeared, he then proceeded to ring every bell up. So he was telling us they were unsafe, and the next thing happened, pulling them all up, and we rang 3 for service. So that's the only time I've rung there. Woburn, another place of interest. And by the way, although the talk's about exploring, I'm talking about exploring historically as well as physically. Woburn, the history in a nutshell is there were 5 bells in the old church, which was done up in the 1829-30 by the Duke of Bedford. And then they put in a new peal of 6. In the 1860s, the Duke decided to build a new church on where St Mary's is now, originally with a great tall spire that came off in 1891. The parishioners would not let him take the bells to the new church, and so he put in a 5,500 weight bell at the new church instead. The 6 bells carried on in the old church, augmented to 8 in 1877, and that's where the association was really born, or the change ringing revival in Bedfordshire started. The Woburn Company of Change Ringers was the first change ringing band in Victorian Bedfordshire. Charles Herbert had come from Sudbury in Suffolk in the 1860s and was a passionate ringer and drummed up interest locally. He was a solicitor's clerk working for F.T. Tankery of a local firm of solicitors in Woburn, and he got his boss to get going as well, taught his boss to ring, recruited a band and established the Woburn Company, formed in 1867. They went on to do great things. They rang a lot of the early peals for the association on the 8, and also rang handbell peals of up to Bob Royal and Bob Maximus, particular achievements for the time. So there's real history at Woburn. And I remember when I first went up the tower of the old church in 1981, it was as if the ringers had just walked out. It was dusty and dingy. The walls were very very poor in decoration. The plaster, the paintwork had faded. But again, as at Wilmington, there were pencil change ringing figures on the wall and graffiti. There was the remains of a Sieg silent apparatus, which they could use for practicing with the bells tied, and texts over the windows. Sadly, just a couple of years afterwards, it was all painted over with modern paint. I think they just didn't, the people who took on the Heritage Centre just didn't realise what history they were covering up. So that's all been lost. But I want to tell you a little bit of a story about the bell. The new bells went, the 7 of the bells from the old church went to the new church in 1910. The big bell was smashed up in the tower, 5,500 weight bell, and with 7 of them was recast into the present 8 with a 2,400 weight tenor. Out with the old, in with the new, and there's the record of the first peal on the new bells. 3 hours 36, Kent Major. But in the old church, there remained 1 bell. And I always remember that when we went to ring at Woburn, there was a clapper on the wall behind the tenor box. And talking to Ken Spavins one day, I established that this was actually the clapper out of the bell in the old church. Now, you can see the photo on the left there. The bell is actually very close to the ground, at the bottom of the floor of the belfry. And so how you would put the clapper in, I had no idea. But I worked out that probably if you rang the bell up, you could put the clapper in. So one Saturday morning, I went over, got the keys to both towers from Ken, went up to the old church, went up to the new church, got the clapper, went down to the old church, rang the bell up, set it, went up, put the clapper in, rang a couple of hole pulls to get the tower, took the clapper out, rang the bell down, locked up, down the new church, put the clapper back on the peg on the wall. So I managed to ring at the old church. Steve Stanford's since done the wheel up, and the clapper I think is in it at the moment, but it's not in terribly good condition all the same. Fascinating belfry, 2-tier frame, and the 2 tiers are configured like the 4 pictures on the right. In other words, around the hollow square with bells in opposite directions in that configuration. A very typical frame of the 1830s by Charles Oliver of Whitechapel, who hung them. I'll tell you a little bit about Clifton and the Reverend H.H. Miles. He was rector from 1858 to 1891, and his family had money, which he spent quite a lot of it at Clifton. He restored the church and got into the bells, as we'll see. The thing about Clifton is it had a ring of 5 from about 1590. We have the inscriptions of all of them, except the one that was recast in 1835. And there were definitely a set of 5 by William Watts of 1590. James Keane of Woodstock, IK, you can see in that drawing from the Kimber collection, recast 1 in 1635. And Thomas Mears of London recast another in 1831. But 3 of the William Watts bells do survive. Now, Miles gave a new clock in 1863 and fitted the Cambridge quarters to it in 1868. Put in a chiming machine in 1870, which played tunes on 15 bells in all. And that was replaced in under less than 10 years by the present machine that's there now. When the bells were taken to tailors in 1953, full details were recorded. So there were 6 bells in the ring after 1867, because Miles did add 1 to the ring. But 2 of the bells, 2 more were subsequently added to the ring to make 8. And the other bells were hung for chiming. There are only 3 chime bells now because they're recast and the chimes altered in 1953. But there's one of them on the right, hung on the beam that the 1860s bells were on. It's an incredibly complicated story, but thanks to the bell founders' records, both at Whitechapel and at Taylor's, the parish records, a lot of newspaper reports, I think I've actually finally worked it all out. But the interesting thing here is that they had a very poor rope circle. You can see Alfred Bowell's sketch here of the rope circle as it was before 1906, and the ropes are in all sorts of order. The 7th and 8th particularly miles apart with bells in between. The reason Bell turned the seventh round in its pit and did a couple of other alterations and drew the ropes to give a slightly better circle. But the 8 must have always been tricky. There were 2 8-bell peals rung there before the rope circle was improved, and F.E. Robinson called a peal of Stedman triples there in 1906 after the work had been done. But if you look at these plans of what was upstairs, you can see that it's a 5-bell frame, and in the middle, the left-hand pair of these sketches shows that the third was hung above the old 5-bell frame, and then the 2 trebles were just hung on beams higher up. Those beams were from the single beam holding the chiming bells to the other side of the tower. The writing's upside down because I wanted to orientate them all the same way. Anyway, the bells were rehung by Mears as just leaving the trebles were abandoned in 1933 when Mears rehung the 6, but it became 8 again when they were rehung in 1953. Fascinating story, fascinating installation. Other chiming sets include the 5 at Dunton, a Warner 5 of 1887, replacing a set of 3, and have a quick listen to those, played on a chiming elegant apparatus. Harlington had a 5 that were hung dead off beams in 1890s, and there was a hope they might have been rehung for ringing in the 1990s, but sadly in the end they were hung as a chime, but made up not first to 6 and then in 2004 to 8. There it's a computer controlled chime, but here's the chiming at midday. I've got a horrible feeling they're going to go off again before I can get off this page. I didn't manage to escape that when I had a dry run last night. Of course, in my explorations, I've been to all the 3-bell towers and all the 4-bell towers, all the lesser numbers. Some very interesting ones. Good examples of Shelton, one of the loveliest churches in Bedfordshire. If you don't know it in North Bedfordshire, it's well worth a visit. Up the tower, the 4-bell frame, stories of a bell having been swapped for one at Hargrave in Northamptonshire, and a 3 that are sort of pretty beaten up but can be swing chimed. Tingriff, also not really very ringable, but a 3 in a medieval frame. And the bell dates you can see here both have bells of a range of dates. Medieval one at Tingriff in the middle, and one of 1599, rare early bell at Shelton. Single bell towers, 1-bell towers also can be very, very interesting. A couple here that are particularly special. Wrestlingworth on the top has a single bell, Taylor 1820, cast at St Neots, but in a very, very fine 16th century 3-bell frame. I thought it was good when I saw it back in the 80s, but to be honest, when we revisited a couple of years ago, it's actually a stunningly good frame, really interesting case. And at Sundon, another fabulous church, there's another Rufford bell cast at Toddington nearby, but again in the remains of a 3-bell frame, and this is an earlier one dating from the 14th century. There's only one pit left, and it's all braced and chopped about, but you can see in the middle picture, in the remaining sill beam, there's the marks in the beam of where the other pits stood, where the other trusses stood. So you've got a lovely medieval bell, which actually sounds rather good as well. The remains of a frame and the evidence that proves that it was previously a 3-bell frame. This bell was rehung by Whites of Appleton for chiming in 2008. Facets of interest about the history of Bedfordshire bells. Well, Bedfordshire has a surprising number of towers that fell. A couple of examples here. Pullock's Hill is the one that really intrigues me because it's known the tower fell in about 1655 and subsequently the nave fell to ruins. Now, I knew there'd been a temporary belfry, and I found the plan at the bottom among the parish records, which shows that the sort of back of the nave had been partitioned off and they'd made a sort of belfry out of it. But I hadn't managed to find any pictures of the church at all. Since I left Bedfordshire, Simon Hoof of Ampthill bought a collection of pictures at an auction in London, and amongst them was this one. That belfry really was as strange as I thought it must have been from looking at the plan. It was replaced by a temporary belfry in 1745, and then the present tower was built in 1845. Shillington Tower fell on St Cecilia's Day, 1701, and there's local myths about the bells having rolled down the hill into the brook below. Anyway, they were kept in the church, put back in the tower when the tower was rebuilt in 1750. Such a wonderful landmark, that tower on top of that hill, in the middle of the countryside. Arlesey's another one, fell in about 1665. Had the pepper pot turret with one bell in it until 1877, when the tower was rebuilt to these plans. But the architect's drawing here does include the excavations of the foundations of the old tower. At Lidlington, everything was lost. Well, you've heard of the Leaning Tower of Pisa, perhaps didn't know about the Leaning Tower of Lidlington. Well, this church was abandoned and rebuilt in 1809, and the bells went with it. The 1809 church fell into ruins in the 50s, and because it had been replaced by one in the village of 1885 later, and that's now closed. So, but before 1809, there were 5 bells in the tower: 1755, 1656, 1680, 1619, and, quote, "I suppose she is the oldest in the steeple." Well, she was. It was the old fourth, cast in about 1440 at Wokingham, like the Chalgrove one we saw. But Mears recast that in 1874, and it was sold in 1957. There's an account in the ringing world saying that the 2 bells from the old church were actually just lying in the churchyard in the 50s. Mears bought both of them for scrap, but it did try hard to find a new home for the little Sanctus bell, but that in the end disappeared too. So Lidlington, a story of going from a ring of 5 to absolutely nothing. The survey that I've done has included all the modern churches, and various people have contributed to this. And Roger, for example, has sent me details of East Hyde and St Andrews Luton, which I haven't seen myself. Other churches with turrets here. These are ones that you can do with a telescope, fortunately, or there are details in the Bell Foundry records. The slightly more interesting one is St Martin's Bedford in the middle, which only has a modern 1970s bell in that little gable on the west end there, but it used to have a freestanding wooden tower with a ringable 1 at the back of the church, a Taylor bell of 1897. But this wooden shed was burnt down in the 70s, and so the bell was lost. Roman Catholic churches, well, generally speaking, in all the areas I've looked at, I've tried to cover the Roman Catholic churches, and there's really not much in Bedfordshire, although this compares with the talk I did on Warwickshire not long ago, where there's a huge amount of material. St Joseph's in Bedford does not have a bell, even though it's got a tower. Christ the King is a modern church with a Mears bell, Whitechapel bell up there. And at Shefford, there's 2 little Mears bells in the turret of St Francis of Assisi, but not many Roman Catholic bells in Bedfordshire. Bedfordshire was a real stronghold of nonconformity, the influence of John Bunyan, of course. So the congregational churches back from the 17th century, the Baptist churches back to the 17th century, Methodists from the 18th century. Bells are very rare in nonconformist churches generally, but the delightful little thatched chapel at Roxton does have a bell, which I didn't know about until Pat Alban sent me details about 15 years ago. It was rehung by Nicholson subsequently. Little bell by Robert Taylor of Son of St Neots just before they moved to Oxford. There was a modern Taylor bell at Restingworth Congregational Chapel. The building's now a house and the turret's gone. And in Turvey, there was a Methodist chapel with a bell, but these again are almost the only examples I know of nonconformist bells. Other religious buildings, cemeteries usually have a bell of some sort. Bedford has a Mears bell of 1861, which replaced a dish bell, hemispherical bell, provided a couple of years earlier. That was given by Mr. Whitbread of Southill. Stotfold Cemetery has a steel bell in its turret, and Biggleswade Cemetery was another rather nasty climb, involved bringing ladders along, lots of pigeon muck, a couple of floors up, and a 200-weight Warner bell of 1868, but we now know what's there. Schools, a couple of schools worth mentioning. Bedford School, the main building sadly damaged by fire in the 1990s or 1980s. But there is a bell in the building, worn in 1859. Quite why there's an older bell in a late 19th century building, I don't know. But the school chapel has a ringable Taylor 1 cast in 1908, which I did go and ring one morning before school assembly. Elstow School down Elstow Road was built in 1869 as the middle class college. It later became the county school, and it closed as a school in 1920s. But it became the headquarters of the Cosmic Crayon Company, which I always think is a fantastic name. Demolished in 1964 and replaced by the Robinson Rental Building. It had 3 Taylor clock bells that I knew about from the Bell Foundry records, 1869, and happily one of them turned up recently. Someone had rescued it at the time, and Cliff and Stephen have now hung it as a Sanctus bell at Kempston, so you can see it there. Churches aren't the only places with bells by any means, and just some of the places that have been explored where bells have been found are shown here. A typical 18th century country house stable block at Hazel's Hall. Sandy Lodge, of course, was now the RSPB headquarters, but it had good 19th century buildings from when the Peel family lived there, and the little Taylor clock chime there that Roger Kendrick and I have both seen separately. Langford War Memorial Clock Tower, Shuttleworth College, Taylor clock chime of 1878, Old Warden Post Office, a Mears bell, Turvey Abbey, a bell of 1796, Rest Park, I'll say a little bit more in about a moment, and another of the village schools. So all of these places that have been visited and explored, if not by me, by somebody else. The Woburn Estate was particularly fruitful for secular bells. They had an alarm bell of 1844 by Mears in that cupola on the now demolished east wing of the Abbey, which was pulled down in the 1950s. We've got Mears's bill for it on the estate archives. Now, places like the Abbey can be difficult to get into, but at the record office, we had very good relationships with the Abbey staff because we looked after a lot of their historic records. And Cecil Rhodes, believe it or not, was the clerk of works, and he was a good friend of ours. And we worked with him very closely when he needed information on the buildings on site. We were able to help him very often, and so getting into the buildings on the estate was not a problem at the time. And Mark Regan and I had an afternoon on the Abbey exploring all these places and rooting out all sorts of stuff. 3 quite historic bells in the Park Farm offices, including one of 1666 and a Bartlett bell of 1654. At Hinwick, in the north of the county, 2 country houses close together, and both with bells of about 1710. Hinwick Hall on the left was bought by Major General John Livesey in 1706, and he remodeled the house and put in a clock and a bell. The bell turned out to be one made by Henry Penn in 1709, and you can see from the rubbing that it's got the Livesey coat of arms on it. I didn't know until I looked at it only the other day that Ken Shrimpson had captured this photograph of me, which he put on his ebook. Rather nice to find it and to use Ken's photo. Just next door, Hinwick House, which was a new build for Richard Alderbar, 1708 to 1714. But there's an old building there which has a clock and a cupola, and it's called the Turret. But the bell is by Richard Phelps of Whitechapel, 1710. The 2 different founders, 2 country houses, both close together at Hinwick. Strange discoveries. Always keep an eye out for bells in unexpected places. The bell at Toddington has a real Warner 1856 bell, brightly painted gold, right on the corner of the building. And the biggest bell in Bedfordshire is Luton Town Hall, 4500 weight in C, very fine bells by Gillett and Johnson, 1936. The town hall at Luton was burnt down in the peace riots in 1919. Good old story there, and not rebuilt until the 1930s. Albert Wilkinson, who was an alderman, left money for the bells, and Gillett's provided this clock chime. They're a proper Westminster clock chime, 1, 2, 3, 6, and 10 of a 10. So the hour bell is considerably heavier than the other bells. I did manage to get up to see those, but nowadays getting into public buildings to look at anything is incredibly difficult. Health and safety, security concerns. I think the glory days of bell hunting are over as far as public buildings are concerned. Rather surprisingly, Albert Wilkinson's gift isn't recorded in the inscriptions on the bells, which all just have the maker's name. One particularly special find was this 1679 original clock bell at Rest Park. And you can see that it's got the coronet and the arms of the de Grey family on the waist on one side. Rest Park was rebuilt in the 1830s for Earl de Grey, and he rebuilt the clock tower, which you can see on the left. It says he laid the foundation in 1834. He'd already had a new clock from John Bryant of Hertford, who's a clockmaker as well as a bell founder, in 1825, and this bell was probably used for that. But when he rebuilt the clock tower, he decided he'd have a bigger bell, so he bought one from Mears, and this bell turned up in private ownership in Silsoe village in the early 1990s. Particularly good to see it. More recently, I had a real surprise tracking down a stolen bell from Ridgemont in Sedgenhoe Church in Ridgemont. Sedgenhoe was the old church of Ridgemont, and it was always dismissed as having been a Georgian rebuild of no historic interest at all. But when it all fell to pieces, it became very clear that it was not only a Norman building in essence, it had got a fine arcade of the 13th century and all sorts of interesting features, and it's now recognised as and preserved as a historic monument. It was certainly done over in between 1820 and 1830 when the old wooden turret was replaced by a rather mean brick tower, and the story of the bells was a little bit uncertain. Thomas North's book of 1883 doesn't give any details. Now, at the Record Office, we had some notes by a chap called L.H. Chambers, who was an antiquarian, particularly interested in parish clerks and other aspects of local history. And his notebook tells us that the Reverend T.M.N. Owen, who wrote a book on Huntingdonshire bells, had seen the bell and told us the inscription. Newcomb made me 16-1 and no final date figure. When the archaeologists were restoring the church in the early 80s, I did get up the tower and looked at the bell frame, but in fact the bell frame and fittings are still there, including the headstock and the stay and the pulley look. Now, in 2012, I had a strange phone call one day from a ringer in the West Country. "Hello, Chris," he says, "I found a bell, and it says on it, Newcomb made me 161. Do you know anything about it?" And it's the way my brain works. But I said, yes, that's the old bell from Ridgemont. And sure enough, I managed to get to see it and took a rubbing of it. And I'm 99.9% sure it is the bell that was probably stolen from Ridgemont around 1965. I don't see any point in recovering it because if it did, it would only be in a church that would be likely to get stolen again. And the guy who's got it is very fond of it and did pay for it when he acquired it. So I'm going to let sleeping dogs lie, but I was delighted to find it. Adventures. In recent times, Steve Stanford and Pat Alban have been around with me a bit, and Heather's been too. And I think they're a little bit amused about some of the antics that I just take as part of normal life. The building I never got up to when I lived in Bedford was the town clock at Amptill. Rather to my surprise, I got permission, and so we trudged in through the tenants of the estate agents down below, up into their upper rooms and into the space below the clock. Climbed up and found that there was a trapdoor leading into the cupola above. But if you look at it, you see that Pickford is not going to get through that hole. Also had to use the 17th, 18th century clock as a bit of a ladder to get up there. Well, fortunately, Pat Alban was up for the job. He got up there and took the bell details for me, and I got some photos and rubbings and measurements and everything I needed. Fascinating installation, two clock bells, one with a clapper, one without look. And they've got different dates on there. They're almost certainly a pair of the same date. I think the founder bungled the date on one of them, but you tell me which date is the right date, because I can't work it out. Anyway, it caused some amusement to Steve and Pat. Now, I also didn't think there was anything particularly odd about standing in the pub garden at Henlow with a telescope looking at the bell in the turret. You know, what's unusual about that? I've just been doing that sort of thing for so long. Anyway, this also caused some mirth, especially since there were quite a lot of drinkers there. They didn't seem to mind drinking a few. The chap suggests they're drinking pints. Oh, this nutter comes in, puts a telescope up, scribbles something on a piece of paper, and clears off. Also, in slightly more recent times, 2019, I had my first experiments at doing a drone inspection. Now, I'm not a drone pilot myself, and I don't have one, but Leicestershire Bell historian John Greenhoff had a student who was disabled and had a drone, and it was his passion. John persuaded this lad to come and have a go at a couple of bells in Luton for me, and he did All Saints in Luton. You can see it's a triple turret, but you can't see the far side of the turret from anywhere. The buildings, the surrounding buildings, don't give us any eye lines. I'd had a telescope up on the side you can see, and there's absolutely nothing on the bell. If you look in the top right picture, the drone is just about approaching the back of the turret, and Sam managed to get close-ups of the bell that showed the inscription very, very clearly. It's a Mears bell, 1920, but it's one that we didn't know about that we do now. It did cost me a bit, though. And more or less lastly, a bit of a memorable incident when we were going around ringing. I have had the privilege, really, of ringing peals at every tower in Bedfordshire except one. I had briefly rung at them all, but there's another one now. And one of the places we went to in 1982 was Keeso, which are very much a favourite peal of bells of mine. It's a lovely spot, an interesting church, and I find the tone of the bells, or not the go, absolutely lovely. The tenor particularly, Edward Arnold, 1772, is a really fine bell. On the west side of the tower, there's this plaque recording William Dickens, who died in 1759, but the miracle of his survival from a fall from halfway up the spire in 1718 when he was pointing the steeple. On his way down, he said, "What's the matter? Lord, have mercy upon me. Christ, have mercy upon me." And so it tells a story about how he fell from his bosun's chair. But he fell all the way from up there, cracked the pinnacle on the way down, and landed on the ground, but lived to tell the tale. Anyway, on the right, there's a bit of a silly collage I put together to record this incident. We went to ring. Sorry. Went to ring the peal. Went up the stairs to oil the bells. And sitting on the headstock of the fourth by the window was a baby owl, ever so sweet, standing about 3 inches tall, just sitting there. What were we to do? Were we to leave it there? Were we to ring and see if it fell off? Well, Jim came up with the idea. He picked it off, put it in the window ledge, rang the peal, get best part of 3 hours, went back up afterwards. The owl was still there, so Jim put it back where it was. All went away. But I like to remember Jim by that story, and it was rather a fun thing. So, where's all this going? Until it's superseded, North's 1883 book is still the definitive work on Bedfordshire bells. But as a result of the work that I've done in catching up over the last couple of years, I now have a complete survey with a tower history for every church for the whole of the county. It just needs turning into a book, but it's 543 pages as it is. It's not intended as a seller, it's intended as a work of record for anybody who might be interested in the future, and to put on record the information that I've collected over the years. It's coming on reasonably well, and I haven't been able to get much done over the last 12 months because I've been extremely busy. But if it's any consolation, my other unfinished projects, the Warwickshire book I was working on when I first came to Bedfordshire in 1978, still lags a long way behind. Is the research and exploration complete? Well, never is the short answer. There's always more to see, and there's stuff that one would like to find out. I've never actually seen the bells at Fairfield Hospital Chapel, which is being converted when I was coming around a couple of years ago, and would be keen to do so if an opportunity arose, though I do have details. The one that eluded us, even with the drone, the telescope and a telescopic lens, is a little bell at Luton, at Lee Grave St Luke, which has a maker's mark on the one side. It's almost certainly a fairly boring 20th century bell, but I would like to know what that maker's mark is. And Luton St Saviour at the bottom is a Warner bell with a Doncaster head, almost certainly 1904 when the turret was built. But you can't see at the other side of it from the road, and all the inscriptions on the other side. It's also in the flight path of Luton Airport, so you're not allowed to use a drone there. I got turned down when I tried to get up when roof repairs were going on a couple of years ago as well. So I'll give up on that one unless something crops up. And at Chellington, although I know the bells have gone, I'm not completely sure that the bell frame was all totally removed. It's another one that I haven't actually been upstairs, but I've got most of the information. So those are the sort of things that if the information came my way, I would be glad to have it. But I'm not going to hold the job for that. As far as I'm concerned, I'll draw a line on Bedfordshire's latest edition, the new Ring of Six at Steppingley, which I did look at the last day I was out and about before lockdown, 14th of March 2020, on the way home from a pill at Eton Soken. Mm-hmm. The church was rebuilt in 1858 to 60, but I just love that watercolour of the old building. The bells were augmented and restored just before lockdown, and it was funded mainly by a bequest from my dear old friend Andrew Underwood, the Ampthill historian, who used to know very well in my record office days. He used to bring in armies of schoolboy volunteers on Friday afternoons for years, and was very regular visitor to the record office himself, who sadly died in 2012. But I know that he'd be delighted to know that this work has been completed. He asked me about it, and I prepared some ideas for him when I was technical advisor years ago. So it's great there's another edition. But that's where I shall draw the line on this project, unless other information comes to light. So, belfry exploring is what I do, and I'm keen to resume. I've only seen three belfries in the last 14 months, but I'm also keen to get back to the belfry, to do some ringing, and to enjoy the après ring. This wonderful postcard that George Pike dug out and sent me some years ago seems a good point to finish.